I'm very happy on behalf of the Calcutta Research Group to welcome you to the second session of Security at Crossroads, which is a series of webinars that is organized by the Calcutta Research Group to problematize security studies by focusing on non-traditional forms of security. To this end, we are organizing a series of webinars that explore the many different and often marginalized facets of human security. So, in the first session, we critically engaged with questions of land, food, and water security, examining government schemes in India and the continuing marginalization of the most dispossessed. In today's session, we ask questions of borderlands and life. The purpose of this webinar is to decolonize the security question and relocate it within the ambit and issues of life, life of the nation, people, and in particular lives of vulnerable population groups relegated to a bordered existence. The issue of security thus lies at the crossroads of rights, justice, and vulnerabilities. Therefore, the important questions that we ask are: how do the lives in spaces of exceptional dwelling, such as camps or borderlands, constitute our understanding of security institutions? How does the need for dialogic justice and its principles and practices emerge out of ethnic conflicts, resource conflicts, and derogation of rights? Examining all this, the second webinar of the series is entitled as Security at Crossroads, which is on, specifically boundaries and borders, and it aims at discussing lives of borderland people, how they negotiate with the legality, illegality, security, and insecurity conundrum, navigating multiple forms of control, regulation, and freedom. With three esteemed speakers, we try to understand how borderlands and similar exceptional spaces constitute our understanding of security institutions, how do border infrastructures shape borderland lives, and how do movements of people and goods between and across such human-made boundaries negotiate with the security-insecurity nexus. So before we move on to our speakers, let me, with great honor and pleasure, introduce our very illustrious moderator, Professor Paula Banerjee. Thank you, firstly, Paula, for agreeing to be a part. She needs no introduction, of course, but let me still say a few lines. Paula is the IDRC Endowed Research Chair in Gender and Forced Displacement at the Asian Institute of Technology, Bangkok. Professor Banerjee is also the former Vice Chancellor of the Sanskrit College and University, as well as a former Director of Calcutta Research Group, and also a former President of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration. Pauladi is the author of Borders, Histories, Existence, Gender and Beyond. I think we all know about these works, and the co-editor of Women in Indian Borderlands and many others. Of course, we couldn't think of anyone better qualified than her to moderate tonight's discussion. So thank you so much, Pauladi, once again. And it is over to you now to introduce our esteemed speakers for the evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Shucharita. One should always ask one's friends and junior colleagues to introduce you, because they give such a nice patina on what you are that you even can't recognize yourself. So take it with a sackful of salt, what Shucharita said about me, but I'm very excited about the panel today. The question for today is security as crossroads. You see, security is always presented as a dyad between security and insecurity. Anything that is not insecurity is considered as security. But when we try to define security, then the problem is we always start with the definition of national security, but do not think of individual security. And we are going to talk today about a zone, about a region that is particularly given to this conundrum. I'm still not sure whether we are going to talk about borders or borderlands, because both these two concepts are completely different from each other. One begins with the other, but it is not actually the same thing. We often conflate the two and think it's the same thing, but a border is not a borderland. I guess since it's Calcutta Research Group, it has to be borderlands. And we will talk about the life in the borderland. Again, the life in the borderland is very different from the life surrounding the borderland. Because you see, the borderland as it stands today, if we have to consider it as a spatial borderland. The problem is, you see, the whole notion of borderland today is getting sort of very murky because now we are talking about mental borders, borders of food, borders of culture. But actually, to begin with, the borderland is a spatial you know, concept. And it is a region where, you know, if we look at it from a statist perspective, it is a region where one state ends, but one state begins. Okay, so it is that liminal zone where, you know, it is very difficult to divide it. That's why the concept of border, the concept of just a line across that spatial sort of construction is very difficult to make. And borderlands is still slightly bigger as a concept. And in borderlands, we have a lot of movements because we always think of borderland, and I think Sucharita also talked about that, as an exceptional space. But the borderland is not an exceptional space. From the time that state existed, borderlands existed as well. So why is one an exception and the other a given? And when we look at, you know, life, as Calcutta Research Group talks about life in borderlands, then there are many kinds of life. Cows that traverse through the borderlands are lives. But if we talk about human life, then there are people who are existing because of the border, you know, the businesses around the border. There are people who are subverting the border. There are people who are merely crossing the border. There are people who are being criminalized because they're crossing. There are so many aspects of it. And I'm sure since one of the speakers I know will talk about the Myanmar-Bangladesh border, we will also bring that into our ambit of discussion. So let me now introduce three of our very, as Victoria said, esteemed speaker, very good speakers, also very prolific scholars, all three of them, and people that I personally know and am very fond of. So our first speaker will be Paulo Novak. He is from the Department of Development Studies, SOAS, and Paulo was prolific in his work. He heads a lot of research institutes, migration, mobility and development, migration and diaspora. He's also working on geopolitics. And Pablo is also another person who is very situated in our region. This is a discussion on Asia. And Paulo, I mean, the amount of times he's come here, he's worked here, etc., he's very situated there. He is, but most importantly, for us and our scholarship, Paulo has always informed our scholarship because he has always been a collaborator, a co-conspirator, and a dear, dear friend. So Paulo is our first speaker. Our second speaker is one of our own, Anita Sengupta. Anita is the director of Asia in Global Affairs. And Anita, more importantly for us, Anita is one of the former directors of Calcutta Research Group. Anita was also a senior fellow at Maulana Azad Center for Asian Studies. Anita is known for her prolific work on a region where, if you look at with a torch in India, it's very difficult to find people who work on that in that region. Anita is a region on Central Asia. She also works on Turkey. More importantly, Anita is a very, very serious scholar. So when she works, and she's one of those, let's say, disappearing breed of area studies specialists who take area studies seriously. So when Anita does a region, she learns the language. So Anita is prolific in multiple languages, and I just cannot name all her publications. It is that many publications. But I will just mention Eurasian alternatives in an era of connectivity, heartlands of Eurasia. China in India's neighborhood is one of our co-edited volumes, which is making quite a name for itself. And Onita is a dear, dear younger sister for me. So, Onita is part of Calcutta Research Group. Onita is very much situated in Calcutta Research Group, and we are very proud of her scholarship. The third speaker is also a dear friend, Shafqat Munir. He's from Bangladesh. He's from the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies. He's a senior fellow there. The moment I hear the word senior fellow, I get scared because that means it's a person who can concentrate on research. We are of the breed where we have to teach a few hours and then we can concentrate our research. So Shafqat Munir is part of the lucky few who can just work on his research, and he does amazing research as well. Most importantly for me, he's interested and he works on feminist foreign policy, which is quite exceptional. For a serious researcher of the masculine gender to be interested on feminist and feminist foreign policy. And these are the people who actually gives other young scholars to give permission for them to work on feminism. And they realize that feminism is not just for women. Feminist doesn't easily transfer to the female gender because it impacts on everything and everyone, particularly on the question of security. And he also speaks on, geopolitics, crisis response, and security. So his region, spatially, he traverses quite a large region, and we have particularly requested him to talk about the Myanmar-Bangladesh borderlands because he has for many, many years now followed the Rohingya situation. So I'm very proud to introduce this wonderful panel. And please, the speakers, you will have about 18 minutes each. And once that is crossed, I will give you 2 extra minutes. My job here is that of a timekeeper. So after 20 minutes, we will gently tell you we are switching off your microphone if you don't mind. So we'll be very polite. But since I'm older than all of you, I guess you will accept my usage of my seniority to keeping you to a specific time because we have to give enough time so that we have a very good, list of participants here, very experienced as well as young researchers. We would like to hear all their responses. We want this to be a holistic discussion. So without much ado, Paolo, over to you, 20 minutes, please.
Thank you,
and
Paula. Thanks for the
camera. When it's 18 minutes gone, I will switch on my camera. That'll be your cue.
I actually, as I will say, well, first of all, let me thank everyone, the organizers, for this kind invitation. Let me thank Paula for the generous introduction. And it is always a pleasure to be here with so many friends and co-conspirators, as Paula was mentioning, and, share a Zoom platform with people I learned so much about and from over the years in our conversations. I'm also particularly pleased to participate in a kind of conversation that frames the security question across various regional contexts. I think this is what border studies is about, exploring one particular question and trying to think about similarities and differences in different regional contexts. There are, of course, difficult aspects in these conversations. For once is to understand the terms of references. For example, I was given 12 minutes as opposed to 18, so do not worry, Paola, but I think I will be well within the time limits that I was allocated. There is also a question of, which regional context. As Paula was mentioning, my scholarly roots are to be traced to the South Asian region. But again, I was invited to speak about my more recent research on the EU border. and this is will constitute the referent for my intervention. But I think there is a more kind of fundamental problem in these kind of conversations across regions, and that is how to, use concepts that are difficult in and on themselves, and how to translate or transpose, and whether it is possible at all to translate and transpose these contexts across regions. I mean, Paula correctly emphasized how the term borderland has become a bit of a catch-all phrase, which I would think requires some more thinking, some more study, some more elaboration, because it has transformed so much over the decades that again, it may be used in different ways. For example, my research is concerned with a small central Italian province, which I do consider as a sort of borderland. But of course, it is a borderland that is defined in ways somewhat different than those that Paula was mentioning. There is no clear borderline over there. The state, in a territorial sense, does not begin and does not end in that small province. The borderline is far away, it's somewhere else. And yet, I think there is an analytical merit to consider places like this central Italian province as a sort of borderland. And so, perhaps contrary to the introduction that will require me to speak about life in the borderland, I think I will frame my intervention in terms of life of the borderland. I will try to think about the different processes that may concur to create borderland. In other words, I'm guided by the last sentence in the concept note, whereby I think it was asking to think about connections and boundaries that create borderlands. And I will take the EU border management as my referent. So I will try to sketch an understanding of the kind of processes that create borderlands by first kind of contextualizing the security question when it comes to migration in the European context. And I will try to progressively broaden the gaze on securitization to expand and go beyond an exclusive concern with migration management. So to me and to many scholars, the so-called securitization of migration of concern very much today in Europe and elsewhere is something that in the European context started to become prominent both as a lens and as a way of formulating policies in the 1990s. And the reason why I think in Europe this came to be the moment in which securitization came to be the principal logic informing migration management questions, has to be seen at the intersection of the globalization project that was about to begin, i.e. the active and conscious project of creating particular kind of connections across the world. And on the other side, the kind of beginning of the crumbling of the refugee regime that had served these purposes of migration containment during the Cold War. So I think the 90s, and as a result of these and other forces, a series of transformations in the ways in which migration is understood, debated, and migration policies are formulated can be traced to that period, and the essential traits that characterize migration management today, emerged then. For example, it was in the 1990s that migration came to be framed as a security concern for the first time, as opposed to a labor market issue or a refugee issue as something completely separate from each other. So migration came to be seen and associated with issues related to sovereignty, to border control, and cast as an internal/external security problem. It was also in this period that migration came to be framed as a threat to national values, to the cohesion of the nation, as well as to, in the more conspiracy theory, as a threat to demographic equilibrium. But more granularly as well, it was in this period that migration came to be associated and linked with issues of welfare and service provisions, which of course, came to alter and change the way in which we think about citizenship in Europe, a point that was made long ago by Bridget Anderson and others. I mean, of course, the 1990s, was also a period in which the EU came or began to project itself as a beacon of liberal democracy, as an institutional project deeply concerned with democracy, human rights, and so on. And of course, right before and after the Cold War, the need for migrant labor, for cheap, docile labor, continues unabated in Europe. And in a sense, the result of these seemingly contradictory imperatives was the development of a set of border management policies that the EU frames under the catch-all phrase integrated border management. Again, one of those concepts that moves across regional contexts, even if perhaps with slightly different connotations. A way of managing borders whose principal aim is that of differentiating forms of migration for the purposes of governing them, i.e., creating distinct channels for desirable and undesirable forms of migration. And in the context of irregular migration, which is the principal concern from a security perspective, perhaps the concept that best captures this way of framing migration management policies is that of the humanitarian border, a concept that was coined by William Walters to, kind of capture the uneasy alliance, as he calls it, between security concern and humanitarian principles. So William Walters' work and analysis is quite theoretical, but just to give a concrete sense of what the humanitarian border is about, it perhaps makes sense to refer to what in policy terms are called mixed migration flows, i.e., complex population movements, and I'm reading here a definition by UNHCR, which include refugees, asylum seekers, but also economic migrants, and also potentially terrorists, criminals, and so on. So in the context of what policymakers describe as mixed migration flows, the main concern of border management is that of kind of separating, distinguishing between those that are cast as victims to be saved and those that are instead seen as a threat to the nation. I think the IOM definition of humanitarian border management captures well this tension that Walters, in much more analytical ways, tries to capture. So the IOM says humanitarian border management is, on one hand, concerned with sovereignty and the security of countries affected, but on the other hand, it is concerned with respecting, protecting, and promoting the human rights of people crossing borders. So it is that kind of uneasy alliance, as Walters call it, that animates humanitarian border management, and that translates into a set of policies that govern the process of crossing borders as a matter of life and death, okay? Whereby irregular migration, irregular migrants are not only classed as threats, categorized as threats to the nations, but also as victims to be saved. Or in the formulation by Claudia Aradao, they're both persons at risk and persons that constitute a risk to the nation. Okay, two examples of the way in which, in the European context, this uneasy alliance is translated into concrete policies relate at the most militarized end of the spectrum, if you wish, relates to what in this context we call search and rescue operations, i.e. militarized patrolling of international waters or national waters aimed at, both saving human lives, but also protecting the European space. If you read standard operating procedures by Frontex, the European border agencies, you will see how the security concerns animate their operations, but they're also always tempered by an appeal to humanitarian principles, to European directive on emergency and humanitarian and human rights, and so on. At the other end of the spectrum is the kind of asylum reception policies that have been set up as part of this migration management system. These are the ones that I more directly studied. For example, the asylum seeker reception centers that are of concern to my research are places quintessentially informed by humanitarian practices, and yet at the same time, they are places of control, places of confinement, places, with strict surveillance mechanism that express forms of marginalization and subordination that makes the lives of asylum seekers expendable and exploitable, but within the respect of the formal respect of a series of rights. So in a sense, the first point I wanted to make is that security imperatives are not the only force animating humanitarian border management, but rather that we should think about the ways in which security and human rights, i.e. the various institutional principles that animate the EU project, are combined to create specific policies. This uneasy alliance is, of course, changing over time. It's obviously needs to be updated. There are moments and places where the security imperative is more pronounced, and others where vice versa, the concern with humanitarian practices is more pronounced. But the point is precisely never to consider the security question in isolation from other questions. In fact, I wanted to take this point forward to make a second point. Border management is never just about migration, although the security question when it comes to circulation is primarily framed around the issues of concern with trafficking, smuggling, irregular migration, and so on. The way in which EU border management operates always exceed an exclusive concern with security, or at least it productively uses a concern with security to enter into broader forms of circulation management. Consider, just 2 or 3 examples. I'm thinking about the EU deal with Turkey, i.e. a bilateral agreement whereby Turkey was receiving and accommodating Syrian refugees in refugee camps set up in its own border zones, in exchange for sure for a lot of money involved, but also with some concessions related to the preferential visa treatment for citizens of Turkey. The same can be said in all the agreements, again, initiated for the purposes of migration, that the EU undertakes with West Africa, and which, beyond biometric database surveillance, beyond police cooperation, also involve fisheries and quotas and catchment area, and the creation of zones whereby European fishermen vessels can operate and extract resources. They create effectively zones and partition international waters so that EU fishermen industries can operate. The same can be said about EU deals with CARICOM countries, Caribbean countries, which involve preferential forms of trade for example, the opening of markets and broader relations. So in a sense, from this perspective, border management, again, should not be exclusively seen through the lens of security, but rather broaden in its case to think about the often contradictory set of policies and practices aimed at managing the circulation and the relative position of people and things in relation to the various spaces produced by borders. So this is not really just about security, however tempered by humanitarian concern, but it's about the production of these spaces and the relative position and location of people and things within them. And I think beyond the analytical quirkiness of this, I think it is an important point to make if we are to heed one of the crucial points of the concept note informing this webinar, i.e. that of decolonization and decolonizing the security question. In a sense, by thinking about the security question in this broader border management sense, we are reminded that despite William Walter's claims to novelty, the management of people's circulation have always exceeded migration concern. In fact, it is a novel way of...
I'm sorry, but you have to sum up.
Yes, it's a novel way of conducing, long-standing practices that have colonial roots. The third and final point, which I will only sketch, is that if we are to think about how borderlands are created in today's world, we need to think about these processes and the way in which they take place, and the way in which wherever they are implemented, whether it's an Italian province, in the central Mediterranean, or in international waters, there will always be processes of contestation, escape, and engagement, which are performed by both migrants and non-migrants. And it is in that, question of life, as the concept note was framing, that we can see the production of borderlands. In a sense, if borders are everywhere, borderlands are everywhere too. And I will leave it here for further discussion.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Your 3 points are well taken, and I'm sure there's going to be questions about that. Now, without spending any extra time, let's go over to Dr. Anita Sengupta. I've already introduced her. So, Dr. Sengupta, over to you. You also have 18 minutes. After that, I will switch on my camera. And if you go beyond 20 minutes, I will let you know. So, Anita, please take over.
Thank you so much, Pauladi. As always, it's a pleasure to be a part of discussions led by the Calcutta Research Group. My brief, of course, was to talk about Central Asia, but I will begin with just talking about a border that is closer home. I travel across the Delhi-Haryana border about twice a week. And until the beginning of this year, when 3 layers of concrete structures were erected and barbed wires installed across the Shinghu border to stop agitating farmers, but also effectively the regular vehicular traffic causing long detours and confusions, it had always been a mystery to me as to where that border actually was. I had once asked a local inhabitant where it was, and he told me that Agarwal Sweets marks the boundary, and that is how people on either side know whether they have crossed Delhi into Haryana. This, of course, is an internal state boundary, and except for exceptional circumstances, which, of course, is determined by the state, the border is of no consequence to anybody except for the officials who collect tolls from commercial vehicles who cross over. We get discussion with this intra-state border as an illustration of the fact that the absence of a clearly demarcated border actually rarely poses a problem for those who inhabit the spaces around it and live their lives on both its sides. It is the occasional excess of it that is very frequently the problem, and it is this excess of borders and its impact on the life of inhabitants of borderland spaces that I will be talking about today, with the aim of understanding what actually security means for those who live on the borderlands, and who is it actually for. In fact, one should begin with an acceptance of the fact that the border is intrinsically multiple by nature. The border on the map The border of the border guards and the officials in the state capital and the border of the local trader who trades across the border are actually very different borders. This, of course, poses an empirical challenge to our understanding of borders because our understanding is, of course, informed by state cartography. It also leads to the inevitable conclusion that more demarcations and fences is, of course, not obviously the solution all the time because it is impossible to securitize across so many real and imagined borders. I will be focusing on two questions today. How do borderland dwellers define security, and what are their coping mechanisms for dealing with what is very frequently seen as an excess of state control? Fluidity had marked borders in many parts of the world, including Central Asia, where they had until recently been of no consequence to those who lived their everyday lives across them. Demarcated borders suddenly assumed significance when the state intervened and borderland spaces were redefined as nationalized places and securitized with the understanding that an undemarcated border is a threat to a culturally united citizenry. One such region is the Fergana Valley, now shared by Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, with intermixed populations and unmatched modern borders. This is complicated by the fact that the Fergana is home to both traditionally nomadic and sedentary populations, and their proportions in the region varies greatly. Seasonal movement here had been a way of life, and land, water, mazars, grazing lands, and burial grounds were shared accordingly. This region today is identified, therefore, as an ideal example of a mismatch between ethnicity, territory, and citizenship, and it is not surprising that a discourse of danger dominates state narratives in the valley, justifying authoritarian forms of governance as a guarantor of state security. The way in which this discourse of danger is narrated by the state, however, is very different from the way in which it is actually experienced, negotiated, and also occasionally resisted by those in the borderlands. For the state, transgression at borders is marked as a threat to sovereign security. For the borderland dwellers, the closing of borders across which they live their lives is a threat to their everyday existence and way of life. I will briefly talk about marginalized borderland experiences in two sites in the Fergana. In the largely rural enclaves like Sok, Sadwak, Baruk, there are about 8 enclaves in the Fergana, and in the urban spaces of Osh, a frontier city on the Uzbek-Kyrgyz border. I will do this by differentiating between the perspective of the elites who imagine and manage the border, mainly from the capital cities, and the non-elites or the borderland dwellers who live among the boundaries and experience its non-materiality on a daily basis. Sok is an Uzbek enclave within Kyrgyzstan. Sok's residents are predominantly ethnic Tajiks, with some Kyrgyz and almost no Uzbeks. The majority of the local government officials, however, are of course ethnic Uzbeks. Authorities in Tashkent have viewed the Tajik-populated enclave with suspicion, and incursions by the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan through the region reinforced them and prompted authorities to tighten control of movement in and out of the enclave. Between 1999 and 2001, a border materialized and landmines were planted by the Uzbek authorities to prevent the infiltration of Islamic militants, and this killed numerous local residents. Though the government began to subsequently remove these landmines, stiff security measures continued to make travel outside the enclave difficult for residents. However, for the residents, it was the very ambiguity of borders that had allowed the continuance of traditional relations and maintenance of peace in areas that were considered to be commons and traditionally shared between communities on both sides of the border. This, of course, required uninterrupted access between neighboring villages. It was attempts to impose border controls, passport checks, and barbed wires across these borders that complicated centuries of systems of coexistence and led to what is known as ethnic conflict. In much of the borderlands, a discursive regime of citizenship and citizenship control, of civilized borders and territorial clarity is not merely resented, but seen as a source of danger. As one citizen of a Tajik village whose home lies just meters from the border with Kyrgyzstan said, tensions will rise the day I'm asked for my passport just to visit my relatives in Ispara, a journey that involves crossing in and out of Kyrgyz territory twice. Why should I have to carry a passport with me as though I were a thief or a lawbreaker when I actually live here? Given the strength of this local feeling, it is important to ask, why is it that accounts of peace and conflict potential in the region regularly cites the ambiguity of territorial borders and the presence of minorities as root causes of conflict? The answer, of course, is in the conceptual framework that informs narratives about the Fergana Valley. And this is a narrative that rests on the view of a relationship between ethnicity, territory, and citizenship, with the understanding that danger derives from their non-correspondence. Undemarcated borders are transformed into unresolved border disputes, and the destruction of border controls imposed by neighboring states is seen as building of inter-ethnic tensions. In the January of 2003, border posts had been set up by Kyrgyz and Tajik authorities around the Varuk enclave was violently dismantled by villagers from both sides of the border. Border control wagons were overturned in retaliation for the large fines that were being extracted from drivers of lorries who were transporting contraband metal along the road from Osh to beyond. The contraband, the bribes, the resentment of border control that was at the heart of the incident are, of course, nothing new to the Fergana Valley. What is striking, rather, is the character this incident acquired by the time news about it reached Bishkek and beyond. The overturning of the wagons, because it involved participants from neighboring ethnic groups and occurred in a border area, was cast as an indicator of growing inter-ethnic tensions, with violence between two communities only held in check by the decisive action of the state's law enforcement agencies. The impression that emerged from reports of the incidents of antagonistically positioned ethnic groups violently spurring with one another, and the incident at the border posts was seen as a conflict between two conflicting communities. It is interesting to contrast this account of the conflict with the version of events related by a participant, a member of a Kyrgyz village, on the southern side of which borders the Varuk enclave. And he says, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they started putting up all sorts of posts, custom posts, border posts, and all these stop people from living. It really hinders them. It's mostly after the Batkin events that they started putting up these posts. Many of them started to check documents, and these posts aren't good. People are not happy with them because we live here for almost 100 years as neighbors. We understand one another, we know of one another. Why on earth should we need these posts? The second narrative clearly indicates that the conflict here is between us, villagers, and the state, not communities against each other, by presupposing that any act of violence in a border area is at least potentially an inter-ethnic conflict waiting to happen. The capacity of the states and its representatives to be catalysts of the conflict is often ignored by making ancient intra-ethnic hatred, at least implicitly, the explanatory variable. The role of other regions, custom officials, border guards, road police, and others are ignored as instigators of conflict. Similarly, in its people with their language, use, cultures, and their dense social and economic links to other places, Osh remains an hybrid frontier urban space, inseparably linked to the cultures, languages, and modern history of both Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. While most of the literature on the conflict over urban space is focused on competitive uses of urban space, given the increasing trends of rural to urban migration, the conflict history in Osh is complicated not just by recent movements, but also the narratives of nationalizing states and the complexities of identifying relationship between urban conflict and the meaning of what is Uzbek and what is Kyrgyz in Osh. The Osh Uzbeks look to one country for their ethnic identification and the other for their citizenship. And with the current state of nation building, it prevents the possibility of meaningfully belonging to either. For many Kyrgyz, the story of Osh can be narrated as attempts of privileged Osh Uzbeks to hinder the Kyrgyz from taking their rightful place in their own city. After the formation of an independent state, the nomadic Kyrgyz increasingly began to move into Osh to take up their roles in the modern urban life of the country. However, to incoming Kyrgyz, it seemed as if the Uzbeks had the best lands, the wealthiest businesses, and the best houses in the best locations, that the Kyrgyz were actually second-class citizens in their own state. In Osh, it has appeared as if the Uzbeks also controlled much of the economy. All but the wealthiest of the new rural migrants were squeezed into cramped apartment blocks that had been recently vacated by the Russians, and many regarded it extremely unjust that the Kyrgyz should play second fiddle to a minority who in 1990 had turned violently against them. In Kyrgyz narratives of Osh as a contested space, Uzbeks played the role not only of impeding the development of Kyrgyz statehood, but also of threatening the very integrity of the states. And the Uzbeks did it, according to the Kyrgyz, by refusing to acknowledge its Kyrgyzness, as they said. As a borderland city, the flow of people, goods, and capital from Osh had mostly been towards Uzbek cities like Andijan, particularly since, till very recently, the Bishkek-Osh road had been under construction, and in Kyrgyzstan, the north-south divide had always been a discernible one. Frontier identity was cemented through cultural contacts, like the fact that mostly Osh citizens viewed Uzbek television channels rather than Kyrgyz ones. However, since 1999, when borders were closed and bridges were literally burned, logistic connections turned inward and Kyrgyz nationalism became more visible. Borderland insecurity of the Uzbeks increased, particularly because of expanding Kyrgyz migration, and as political boundaries hardened, ethnic identities also became important, and there was an increasing sense of belonging to smaller spaces, my mohalla, rather than that of the shared space of the city. Questions of who belonged to the city, what is native to it, and what was foreign became increasingly significant, and this led to a segregation of spaces where miniature cities actually developed within the larger one. Yet, despite such instances of isolation, there were also numerous instances of Kyrgyz families protecting their Uzbek neighbors and of Uzbek families protecting Kyrgyz ones during the conflict. There were also efforts at distributing humanitarian aid, and in the aftermath of the conflict, community leaders organized festivals like Navruz to invite people from other communities. Osh had once been the main intermediate trade point on the Silk Road from where caravans went further on to Kashgar. In fact, it is still possible to cross over from Kashgar to Osh and vice versa. Osh was also on the proposed rail link between Kashgar and Andijan.
Anita, please try to sum up.
Yeah, I'm summing up. And this is my absolute last couple of lines. Similarly, a new highway built within the framework of the will help Kyrgyzstan in economic development through boosting rural connectivity and create international transport corridors. That is said to, foretell the promotion of growth throughout the region. As Central Asia increasingly becomes part of these new realms of influence, it would be interesting to imagine how these protected developments that an enhanced connectivity would entail would have an impact on these frontier spaces and social relations which lie at the intersection of global connectivity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anita, and thank you for beginning with the farmers' protests in which is supposed to be within a territorial sovereign region, and then conflating it with the borders in Central Asia, and also for pitching the idea of commons, which is something that we don't see in border studies at all. And yet, that is exactly what borders are. But anyway, I'm sure there's going to be tons of questions on all of this. Now we turn to Dr. Shafqat Munir. And if I'm not mistaken, you will talk about the Myanmar-Bangladesh border. So over to you. 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pauladit. First of all, thank you for that very kind introduction earlier. And I'm very grateful to the Mohanirban CRG for inviting me for this webinar. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I learn so much from these sessions. Indeed, I will talk about the Bangladesh-Myanmar border. And as it so happens, I actually spent some time there just last week, touring Kutupalong and some of the other areas in Ukhia in Cox's Bazar district, and talking to the host community, as well as spending some time in the Rohingya camps. So not only I'm going to talk about some of the issues that are already very well known, but I also want to bring some perspective from what I saw in the field. So what was really fascinating, and I hadn't had a chance to go back to that area for some time after COVID, but what was fascinating for me is how the whole place has changed over the last few years, especially after the influx of the Rohingya refugees, but also even in the I would say in the last 2 or 3 years, with and the way the people now look at the refugees, but also look at their own region. For instance, Kutupalong, the place where I spent a bit of time last week, initially had a population of 400,000 people. And after the influx, and especially with the population growing and some fresh influx as well, the population of Kutupalong now hovers around 1.5 million, out of which only 400,000 or maybe a little more are basically the locals, and the rest are essentially people who have come from Myanmar. It is important to note that the influx is still ongoing, and as a matter of fact, UNHCR has just completed a head count, and they have documented 49,000 new arrivals in recent times. So that gives you a picture about the sort of enormity of the challenge Bangladesh is facing. But what was particularly striking for me is how the local host community perceives the new arrivals, and we also had an opportunity to interact with the Rohingya students and many of the inhabitants in the camps, and the sort of tensions which have developed between the two. There was a tendency, at least in the earlier part, when the refugees first came to Bangladesh in 2017, to over-securitize this issue. Whenever the term Rohingya refugees came up, we always talked about that it's a major security risk. It was going to be inundated with Islamist militants. This is a ticking time bomb. Unfortunately, some of that narrative still continues. We have a tendency to sometimes over-securitize the whole problem and only focus it on purely as a security issue. And that also happens because in the case of managing the Rohingya refugee crisis or the whole issue about repatriation, especially under the previous government in Bangladesh, the narrative was shaped by the security agencies. The narrative was also controlled by the security agencies, and they were also involved in managing the whole crisis on a day-to-day basis. So the human security angle, or I felt was sometimes almost missing. That narrative hasn't completely gone away, because I think even very recently, Professor Yunus in his statement has also called it a ticking time bomb. I can completely understand where he's coming from, but I'm just trying to underscore that the narrative remains. The other thing which is very interesting is that, and I'm hoping that we are speaking in a Chatham House environment, so I can speak freely. But one of the other things that is also very interesting is Bangladesh's reluctance to allow education to the Rohingya refugees, especially with the express provision that they can only be taught in the Myanmar curriculum, but any further education is not going to be permitted, so that there is incentive for them to go back and so that it does not incentivize more people to come to Bangladesh. That argument, and me and my civil society colleagues who were part of the group that went to Cox's Bazar, we were still amazed that despite the massive upheaval politically which has shaken Bangladesh in the last 3 months, this narrative still remains very much there. The other thing which is quite interesting is that when we talk about borders, we always in Bangladesh tend to focus on the Indo-Bangladesh border, and we know quite a lot about the Indo-Bangladesh border. There's a lot of scholarship on the Indo-Bangladesh border. If you look at from the Bangladeshi perspective, one of the biggest issues for us is the killings that take place in the border. From the Indian side, there are other issues which are there. But we don't talk about the Bangladesh-Myanmar border enough. It is almost like a forgotten frontier for us. Very few people in Dhaka would actually be able to point you in a map, unless people who are working on it, I'm talking about regular people. I mean, you will be able to point out in a map where places like Kutupalong or Gumdhum or Thamchi is. But these are areas which are the areas adjoining Myanmar, and a significant amount of violence has also taken place there in recent times. We also don't tend to overlook the fact that that Bangladesh actually borders two states in Myanmar, the Rakhine state and the Chin state. And of late, a lot of the violence has been in the Chin state because of the spillover of the civil war that was happening in Myanmar. I spent some time in a local school, and it was quite interesting to listen to the children, students, and their teachers about how the Myanmar civil war affects them. Again, when we talk about the Bangladesh-Myanmar border, we always tend to lately talk about the Rohingya crisis. But there is another whole other element there, which is the civil war which is happening in Myanmar and how that impacts on the people on this side. And there were very interesting accounts and quite somewhat depressing as well about students telling us that sometimes they're not able to come to school because the shell has landed from the other side into their village and there's a fire raging. One student got up and talked about how 200 plus Myanmar soldiers had come to their village and taken refuge. So while in Dhaka, we are completely oblivious to what is going on over there. For the people over there, for a moment, it felt as if I had gone back in time and I was visiting a village in West Bengal in 1971 who are affected from the spillover of the conflict raging in the then East Pakistan or present-day Bangladesh. But when we look at it from Dhaka, there is either very little reportage in the newspapers or the media sometimes mentions it when the border tension gets really high. But again, the reporting is always from the angle of traditional security, whether there could be a conflict, military tensions are running high, but there is very little emphasis on the human stories that are actually playing out in that area. What was also fascinating, and Meghnadi is here, perhaps she has done an enormous amount of work on this, so she can perhaps chime in as well. But what was very interesting was the tensions that exist between the host community and the Rohingya refugees. Because when we interacted with the local host community in Kutupalong, we were told about how cost of essentials have gone high. People don't want to study because with a bare minimum education, you can get a handsome salary in the Rohingya camps. And there was a feeling, again, we are talking about perceptions here. I'm not getting into whether it's right, wrong, or the morality of it. But there's a feeling that the Rohingya refugees are far more well looked after as opposed to the host community. And I was quite starkly reminded of this perception or this situation that exists there. Because when we visited the school, it was basically fighting for very basic essentials like setting up a tube well or getting better quality drinking water for its students. But just a few yards away was a donor-funded learning center for Rohingya refugees, which was in a much, much better condition, very well resourced, very well funded. And again, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be there, but the point is that this is what ultimately fools the perception, and we have to take the perception into account. So when we talk about borders, when we talk about the Bangladesh-Myanmar border in particular, we need to look beyond what we generally do in terms of looking at the Rohingya crisis in terms of numbers, in terms of the damage it has caused to the ecology of the area because of the deforestation and so on. While those are important, we also have to look at these human stories, which often gets buried. And I have to sort of talk about my own tribe here. I mean, those of us who work in the think tank community, academics do a much better job at it. But those of us who work in the think tank policy community, sometimes we are a bit taken by the jargon. We are a bit taken by the sort of policy savvy stories about these crises. And we don't tend to look at the human aspect, the human security aspect enough. The other thing which I was quite struck was that there is this large population which has come to Bangladesh over the last 7 years and continues to come. And other than the fact that we're only talking about a peaceful voluntary repatriation, it's something that has been said at every meeting since the influx started in August 2017. But it's also a large group of people who are devoid of any meaningful future. And there we come to the point of not giving them the right to educate themselves. Even online education is technically not allowed. But of course, with donor support, some organizations like BRAC and others are actually allowing Rohingya refugees or facilitating Rohingya refugees to actually access online education. But the reality is, for a large number of people, the future is not only uncertain, but there are very little opportunities for them to upskill themselves or actually have some faith in a better future. There is, of course, talk about repatriating them to a third country, which is a big priority for Bangladesh. But again, not a lot of headway has taken place. And the bigger, deeper question that we need to ask in Bangladesh, that given the civil war which is raging in Myanmar, can we really repatriate these people? And if we cannot repatriate them in the near future, what happens to them? Do they continue to languish in camps? And how long will the donor community actually continue to sustain it? Let's take a step back and look at 2017. When the Rohingya refugees first came to Bangladesh, I remember I was in Germany at that particular time attending a conference. There's the huge amount of international attention. There was a huge amount of international pressure on Myanmar. But as other conflicts arose, especially after Ukraine and with Gaza and everything, that pressure, that attention, that whole focus has now completely gone away. So the big, deeper question that Bangladeshi authorities need to ask is, what is the future of these people? The other bigger question that we have to contend with now when we talk about borders, because borders are also evolving, that 5 years from now, will we have a border with the Republic of the Union of Myanmar? Or will we have a border with an independent Rakhine state or an independent Chin state? Or when Mongdo finally falls to the Arakan army, perhaps notionally the Myanmar state will have control over Rakhine. But de facto, we will have to deal with a government which is run by the Arakan army. Now, these are very significant issues for us. These are also very significant issues that the Indian government is also dealing with because we both share a border with Myanmar. But then comes the other dilemma, because from our very Westphalian construct, we cannot reconcile with the idea that we will also have to deal with a non-state. So if we are only dealing with the Myanmar state, which is capital located in Naypyidaw, or the constitutional state of Myanmar, or the Republic of the Union of Myanmar, who have very little control over the territories of Arakan and Chin that border us. So a big question for our foreign policy makers right now is, who do we deal with? Do we deal with Naypyidaw or do we deal with the non-state? Can a state which operates within the framework of the international system directly deal with a non-state? Again, I come back to the whole point about our Westphalian construct, because we are programmed to think in a Westphalian manner. I remember Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath used to call it the Westphalian obsession of our states. I mean, in this Westphalian obsession, we are unable to sometimes process the reality. But in real terms, the actual people who are actually running large parts of Rakhine and Chin are actually a non-state. So those questions are very important for us. And those questions also affect their people and our people. And much as we want to insulate ourselves from the civil war which is raging in Myanmar, we are not able to insulate ourselves at all, just as the way Indian states bordering Bangladesh were not able to insulate themselves from 1971. The enormity of the refugee crisis was perhaps much larger, definitely much larger. We're talking about 10 million people there. The numbers may be smaller, but the actual security repercussions are very similar. So I think these are issues that we really need to look at. And also the kind of hard borders we have created, whether the borders between India and Bangladesh or the borders between Bangladesh and Myanmar, don't take into account that people have familial ties which transgress the border. Like, for example, the Rakhine community, which resides in Cox's Bazar, and some of the other indigenous communities which reside in Cox's Bazar and Bandarban area, like the Kuki and others, they have relatives, they have family members who also live in Myanmar. And what happens in Myanmar may not affect me significantly sitting in Dhaka because I am quite away from it, quite a large distance away from it. But for a person belonging to the Kuki community, for a person belonging to the Rakhine community, what happens in Mongdo, what happens in Butidong is also something that affects their lives. And this is something we often don't try to understand. It is very ironic that Bangladesh is a very small country. And again, I go back to Professor Meghna Ghotakarta, who's done a lot of work on this. But our understanding of the narrative or our understanding of everyday lives of people, whether it is in the Chittagong hill tracts or it is in the borderlands of Bangladesh and Myanmar, is often so scant and so often such a majoritarian nationalistic understanding of the issue that even after 53 years, we're not able to understand that why sometimes these people take up arms or why sometimes these people talk about discrimination. So I think when we talk about borders, when we talk about borderlands, when we talk about the human security aspect in the border, we have to look at these issues. I see Paula D has turned on her camera, so that's my cue. But just to sum up, I would say that my experience of working on the Rohingya issue has taught me that we should not be purely looking at it as a security issue. We should be looking at it from a humanitarian angle. And we should be looking at the Rohingya issue now in the light of the events of which are taking place in Myanmar, which is also fueling criminality and other issues. But we have to look at the human angle in the whole story, which again, in our very Westphalian narrative often goes missing. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shafqat Munir. And you have also brought out, again, a very important point in borderland studies, and that is, the two sides of the same coin, humanitarianism and security. These are not contradictory. We often think of it as two sides of a pole, but that's not true. Humanitarianism actually informs security, and security impacts humanitarianism to a very large extent. And the other aspect, I think, which is particularly notable, is what happens when you have mandate refugees and you have poverty surrounding it, and the local people are worse off. So that is why in the recent days we talk a lot about countries of destination and the socio-political situation of those countries in terms of politics, because you cannot just take care of an enclave and think it is secured when all around it is a lot of other issues, including resources, because at the end of the day, in all of these talks, we have come down to questions of resources. Resources inform borderland studies to a very large extent. And then, the dyads that we think about, the two sides that we think about, if we see, we often can conflate them into one paradigm. But I'm sure we have a lot of experts in borderland studies here. There are experts like Meghna. I saw Bharat for a short while. Ronabida is, of course, there. So, I will open it up now. If you have questions in the chat, Tuturita, do we have questions in the chat?
Yes,
Can you
we
just,
do.
give the questions? Please don't start responding. All of you collect your questions. So we will do 3-4 questions together. You collect your questions, and as a panel, I will request you to respond. So Sucharita, please say, read out the questions that are there in the chat, and then we will go to people who might want to ask their questions in person.
Right. So there is one question from Tawafuddin Azimi as of now, and one comment, but really there are more. Anyway, so he's asking, as we are talking about Crossroads, Afghan people are also among the vulnerable. There were many people who were sunk in the Mediterranean Sea with the aim of reaching European countries, and recently a countable number of Afghan people have been killed by Haryana militaries on the border between Pakistan and Iran, which is also debatable. So I think this is not a question, but probably a comment. So if anyone wants to shed any light on it. The second comment is from Faisal Anam, who says that 60 years of genocide on the Rohingya continues. After 14 years, education has shut down in the refugee camps, and that so there is a generation gap among the Rohingyas, and opportunities are disallowed. Okay, and there is one question from Shomota, who asks, I was really interested to learn about the borders as also dividing up the commons. I suppose a similar understanding would be applicable to Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Bengal Bangladesh borderlands as well, shared natural resources and agricultural land. I wanted to ask, does the same thing happens in EU? So I think this is more towards Paulo. So yeah.
Yeah. So, Meghna, would you like to come in at this point? Because Dr. Munir was constantly evoking your name, and we know you're an expert in the field. So, would you like
I'm
to
not.
say anything?
Why
I don't
did
want
you
to
put
put you on
me?
spot. It's just
Yeah,
that
you already did, and Monique did that as well. Anyway, thank you very much for your your comments, Shafkat. I know that we share a lot of the the issues that he has raised, and he appropriately raises the humanitarian issue to look at the borderland from the human in its human face. And 3 points very briefly I would like to touch on, especially since you mentioned, Paula, that you are you are working on feminist foreign policy, and we often wonder what is that. I mean, I get questions about that. So I think one of the interesting things that can be teased out for addressing feminist policies is as how the strategic kind of viewpoints that women's situation has, even in this humanitarian aspect. And I just give you an example. One, yes, it's true that there is a lot of hostility between the host community and the refugees. But one of the interesting one of the interesting findings that we have found in our work is that when we address the host community on these hostilities, there were people, and mostly we were telling this is not something that usually humanitarian organizations or the security organizations usually does, is to point out the fact that, yes, the refugees have rights as refugees, but you have rights as citizens. And often it is it is in places where the host community is underserved in terms of rights that these hostilities take place. When we went in and we addressed this question of rights to the host community through the use of the Right to Information Act, we found very interesting detail that the women, there was, and I draw from Shafkat's presentation that he recognizes that they have more digitalized access. Refugees have more digitalized access than the host community. And one of the reasons why the limitations of digitalization took place was that refugees were using various means to make passports for themselves, and so, or birth certificates, produce documents for validation of their existence, and through illegal means. But as a result of that, the local government stopped birth registration in that whole area. I mean, because Rohingyas were making false documents. So the reaction was to stop all registration of birth. So it was the women who came up and said, what will happen to our children when they go to school? My child is being born now, and after a few months or a few years, he or she will be going to school, and then I won't have a birth certificate. In order for him or her to get admitted to school, I need a birth certificate. So why isn't the local government talking to us about how long is this ban for? Okay, we understand there's a problem now, but how long is it for? They're not asking. And we ask them to fill in right to information applications to the government, asking them this information. And soon after, I think afterwards, so this was one thing that the host community realized they had the means, but no one told them what that means is. So I think it is important for humanitarian organizations not only to address refugees, because that is, of course, their primary, and they get funds for that to address Rohingyas, but they don't get nowadays only as they are starting to get funds to address similar questions to host communities. And so this is an interesting example which we can use, that how women actually has much more strategic thinking because they have children, and children are their future, and they are investing in their children. Poor people invest in their children, refugees invest in their children. So I think this is an interesting case which can be brought out about Borderland. I went to the area as recently as this year, and just before the July uprising, in fact, and we found this. It's true what Shavkat said, that it is not only a refugee situation there anymore. It is a war situation that is encroaching on the refugee situation, the war in Myanmar. The reason is militants are coming in. They are taking refuge in jungles in the border area. They are invading the camps and abducting men. It is interesting that women are putting up a defense. Women stay up all night guarding the houses so their men are safe. So this is a very interesting way in which you can also, through the humanitarian aspect, actually bring in the active and empowering role of the women, and to look at their strategies. I'll end here. Thanks.
Thank you, Meghna.
No, it's just because Meghnati also continued, so I just thought that I'll just, jump in. So I really want to thank Shafkat first, because it's a topic that interests me also hugely. I was wondering, some of the issues that you covered are continuing in the sense of education in the camps and all pressing problems. But as Meghnati also said that, the escalation of security issue in the camps has been immense, of course, due to the war problem, but also it was growing for some time now. Like in 2019, there was this murder of a prominent activist, and it continues. So because we are discussing human security here, and because there has been this July uprising in Bangladesh, I was just wondering, there seems to be a continuation of the refugee policy of Bangladesh, and there seems to have no change despite the fact that the current head of the state is known to be a humanitarian, face all over the world. And he has been making very humanitarian statements about the situation. But then what happens in the ground, as you rightly flagged, is of immense importance here. And do you, and by you, I don't mean only you, but, people who are involved in policy institutions and organizations, are there any progressive thoughts there in in how we can read the security situation, in how we can read, security, absolutely, like, in terms of thinking of security of the Rohingyas also vis-a-vis or in syncing with the security of Bangladesh and Myanmar. So yeah, your comments, reflections.
Thank you so much, Sucharita. So, Paolo, you please begin. Then we will go to Anita and then Shafkat Munir.
Thank you. I have just, two very short comments. The first one relates to the comment made about deaths in the Mediterranean and the various killings. And my only comment here is that I use the word humanitarian and humanitarianism with a lot of caution, precisely because in the context in which I have done research, this word, this concept with these principles have been, well, at best misused, at worst deliberately mobilized to actually, implement the most violent and brutal policies. And so, in a sense, I find myself not always at ease in contraposing a security logic with a humanitarian logic. And my points about the humanitarian border were precisely aimed at challenging such dichotomous understanding as humanitarianism as a force that may temper state violence. I mean, quite often they're one and the same force with different modulations. The second point refers, partly to, this last discussion by Meghna about, and in fact, Shaftak as well, the differential access of refugee populations and local populations to issues such as digitalization, provision of education and services. And again, to me, it's not surprising. This is what borders do. They differentiate. And the whole purpose of maintaining distinctions such as that of citizen, non-citizen, refugee, irregular migrant is precisely to differentiate. And so, again, putting together these two comments, the broader question for me would be, can we still rescue humanitarianism and put it at the service of more tempered forms of violence or more humane concerns with the everyday life security of people affected by it? And this leads me to my third and final point, which relates to the comment about the commons, which, again, in Europe may be more difficult. But certainly, as Paula was saying, resources and resource allocation, resource ownership and use is at the heart of borderland studies. And so if we take this as our entry point and main concern, again, I would strongly suggest to avoid thinking about, foreign populations, refugee population, migrant population, and local populations as two distinct groups which have differential access to resources or whatnot. Rather, and this is where, the few comments that emerge about thinking about specific localities and take populations in there as one group seems to me much more useful, productive analytically, because, it highlights how even within host communities and indeed even within refugee communities, there are profound differentiations in terms of ownership and access to resources. And I think if we are to think about security understood in a very broad sense, we should try to work with those differences within each of these categories rather than kind of reproducing narratives that pitch the two as two contrasting sets of populations.
Thank you so much, Paolo. I will just add one thing, and that is, we have divorced ourselves from understanding humanitarianism as a modality for delivering humane or just, solutions. Rather, humanitarianism has been devoid of humaneness, and it had become an arm of policy. But now, even that is becoming too much for the international system. And we are saying that it's development and not humanitarianism that should be looked upon as a solution. So if we give people, the policymakers, sorry, Shafkat, but when policymakers address this conundrum of the resourcelessness of the population surrounding the camps in Cox's Bazar, then the camp people are getting 2 cooking gases a month. We don't have any. I myself have heard these problems, and these are everyday problems. And when we talk about these things, the answer of policymakers is, yes, we have to make refugees or stateless people instruments of development. They have to deliver services, whether they're trained for that or not. So, we are actually rethinking how to bring back indentured labor in place of refugee population. So that is the solution that is being handed over now. So we are in very problematic neoliberal times, and how we have to contend with that, God alone knows. Anita, would you like to come in and say something?
Now, I am not the first comment on the Afghans and, I was speaking about a particular area, but I'm not, you really cannot deny that not everything is similar in every borderland. So there are issues that are specific to borderlands of particular locations and localities. And the borderland that I was actually talking about is slightly different in the sense that till very recently, there were no boundaries across it. It was the Khanate of Kokand, which became the Fargana Valley, divided into three states. Even during Soviet times, the commons were shared in the sense that water is the most important resource there, and water irrigation channels were shared between communities. Grazing lands were shared. People moved up and down, and it is only very, very recently. Also, very interestingly, border hearts, I mean, border markets, where people, when they said, I'm going to the market, actually meant going to the market on both sides of the border, because different things were available on either side. So when very concrete structures are established, and there is border security, border control, that creates a problem in borderlands that I was talking about. So the question of the commons here is that till very recently, these were actually common spaces that were shared. And I'm not denying the fact that, there were occasions where there were conflicts, where there were actual conflicts between people, but there were also ways of resolving it, which now seems to be problematic because the state intervenes in that resolution.
Thank you, Anita, for clarifying. Also, the person is one of the participants is concerned about the Afghan situation, and it is very concerning because you see, Afghanistan is all but forgotten now, and Afghan refugees are done with and dealt with, and nobody is even bothered about the devastation that has caused Afghanistan as a result of these occupations from a perspective of ecology. How all of this, geopolitics is connected to ecology. We all talk about theories on that. But what it affects people, how it affects people is something that we often tend to forget. Even if we look at the land per se, how it affects the land itself. And I think that's a good segue to go to Shafqat Munir. So over to you for the last of the comments on this discussion.
Thank you, Pallavi, and thank you particularly for highlighting the link between geopolitics and ecology, something we often forget. I think the question about the border dividing the commons, I think there can be no greater example than the Indo-Bangladesh border, where we basically ran an arbitrary line which not only divided people's livelihood, families, uprooted them, but also divided the commons. And till today, 75 years later, the 25 years under Pakistan and 53 years as an independent nation state of Bangladesh, we are still squabbling between India and Bangladesh over river water sharing. That element is probably not as pronounced in the Bangladesh-Myanmar border because of the nature of the terrain and the topography. But of course, those challenges are there. And again, I go back to my earlier point. I mean, there are, of course, very important models that Shamtadi talks about the European Union as a model. I mean, there are very important models like the European Union. but there needs to be a change in our thinking. I mean, right now, Bangladeshis can't even get a visa to go to India. So that's the nature of our people-to-people contact. So I'll leave it there. Uh, Sucharita's question about whether there would be a new progressive thinking on the Rohingya issue after the upheaval, or what I would like to call the monsoon revolution in Bangladesh. Yes, there is some progressive thinking. This is a government where the civil society has a large voice. So we are hoping, and the delegation that I was part of, led by the UNHCR, we are hoping to talk to people in government to encourage them to have a change of heart on certain issues and appeal to the fact that they have themselves, as NGO leaders, as civil society leaders, they have been advocating for this for a very long time. But we also have to recognize that the security situation in the Bangladesh-Myanmar border right now is at a very precarious state. And therefore, the security concerns of the Bangladeshi authorities are also very genuine. I mean, there is as Meghnadi very rightly put out, it's not no longer about refugees, it's also about a looming war next door. When in 2017, these refugees first came into Bangladesh, Myanmar was still basking under the post-NLD Aung San Suu Kyi era, but now it's a country which is literally imploding. So how that will continue to impact on Bangladesh is a very key concern. And again, I am afraid for the time being, at least, security concerns will probably take priority just because of the realities on the ground. But yes, it is very important for us to keep talking about these things. And it is very important for us. And that's why this particular webinar and all the great work CRG does is so important, because ultimately the most important element when we talk about borders is the human. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we had quite a wonderful discussion. We are coming to the end of our time. Sucharita, Shamata, if you have any announcements, please do make it. Otherwise, I enjoyed the discussions thoroughly. And even though I'm an old hat in this field, I have learned quite a bit today. So thank you very much to all the speakers. And of course, we had a very disciplined participation. So thank you to all the participants as well. So over to Sucharita and Shamata now from the side of Calcutta Research Group.
Let me at the outset once again thank Pauladi for steering the webinar so well, for leading the discussion, of course. And I agree with her. We had a very powerful discussion, and I'm sure every one of us learned a lot. Thanks to the speakers, Paulo, Novak, Anita Di, and of course Shafkat Munir. Thanks to also Meghnadi for joining in. To all of you who joined us today in this webinar, for your questions, for your comments. We will have another webinar in this series very shortly within this year. So we will be sending you an invitation for that as well. But before we wrap up for today, I also want to thank all our collaborators for their enduring support, and also, of course, my colleagues at Calcutta Research Group, and last but not the least, Shamotadi, who is down today physically, but thanks to you that you still joined, and for all your work in co-organizing this webinar. So thanks everyone, and we can probably wrap up.